The Infinite Improbability of Hamlet by Michael Hunt. Chapter 1. To fund or not to fund. In the grand scheme of the universe, there are many improbable things. The existence of life itself, for instance, is statistically so unlikely that most mathematicians refuse to calculate it without hazard pay. The odds of intelligent life evolving are even more remote, and the chances of that intelligent life inventing both theatre and quantum physics are so astronomically small that they might as well be labelled somebody else's problem and forgotten entirely. Yet here we are. And here, specifically, was Reginald P. Bottomsworth, a man whose name suggested he should have been a Victorian chimney sweep, but who was, in fact, the artistic director of the Players of Unlikely Fortune, a theatre company whose name was proving increasingly uncomfortably prophetic. Reginald stood before the theatre board, a collection of individuals whose combined artistic vision could barely distinguish between Shakespeare and a shampoo commercial. They sat in a semicircle, their faces arranged in expressions that ranged from mild constipation to severe financial anxiety. Gentlemen, ladies, and those who have yet to make up their minds. Reginald began, adjusting his unnecessarily elaborate cravat. What I propose is nothing short of revolutionary. The board members shifted uneasily. The last time Reginald had proposed something revolutionary, the fire department had been involved, and 3 audience members had developed a rare form of PTSD that manifested exclusively when they heard tap dancing. "We shall stage Hamlet," Reginald announced, pausing for dramatic effect. The board members relaxed visibly. Hamlet was safe. Hamlet was reliable. Hamlet had name recognition. But, Reginald continued, his eyes gleaming with the special madness reserved for theatre directors and people who collect commemorative spoons, we shall stage it with an actual wormhole. The relaxation evaporated like a drop of water on the surface of the sun. "A wormhole," repeated Marjorie Plumsworth, the board treasurer whose approach to financial management could be described as aggressive paranoia. "As in, a hole made by worms?" "No, no, no," Reginald laughed, the sound not entirely unlike that of a dolphin being tickled against its will. "A wormhole, an Einstein-Rosen bridge, a theoretical passage through space-time that connects 2 distant points in the universe." "Is that expensive?" asked Gerald Forthington, who had been on the board for 17 years. Solely because no one had the heart to tell him that the theatre had moved locations 15 years ago, and he had actually been attending meetings at a particularly theatrical dentist's office. "That's the beauty of it," Reginald exclaimed. "I've found a dealer who can provide us with a slightly used wormhole at a remarkably reasonable price." "Slightly used?" Marjorie's eyebrows attempted to escape her forehead. "How does one slightly use a wormhole?" "The dealer was somewhat vague on that point," Reginald admitted. "Something about a bachelor party for a hyper-intelligent shade of blue that got out of hand. But the important thing is, it's certified stable." Mostly stable," echoed Marjorie, writing this down in her notebook with such force that she tore through 3 pages. "Think of the possibilities." Reginald was pacing now, his hands conducting an invisible orchestra of ideas. Hamlet's ghost could emerge from an actual portal to another dimension. The players could arrive from literally anywhere in the universe. The very fabric of reality would bend to our artistic vision. "And the budget?" Marjorie asked, her pen hovering like a dagger. "Ah, well." Reginald tugged at his cravat again. "That's where things get a bit innovative." The next 17 minutes consisted of Reginald outlining a financial plan so creative that it made modern art look like accounting textbooks. It involved 3 different cryptocurrencies, a timeshare on a planet that might or might not exist yet, and the pawning of what Reginald described as temporal assets, essentially betting on the company's future success to fund its present activities. By the time he finished, the board members sat in stunned silence, their brains attempting to process what they'd just heard and largely failing, like vintage computers asked to run modern software. "So," Reginald said, clapping his hands together, "shall we put it to a vote?" The vote, surprisingly, was not unanimously against. This was primarily because 2 board members had fallen asleep. One was texting his wife about dinner plans, and Gerald was voting on whether to have his cataracts removed, a meeting he thought he was currently attending. Thus, by the narrowest of margins, the players of unlikely fortune approved what would later be referred to in theatrical circles as that thing with the wormhole that we don't talk about without a drink first. As the board members filed out, still dazed, Reginald remained in the room, grinning, like a man who has just convinced a group of penguins to invest in a hairdryer. His phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number, wormhole ready for pickup, cash only, no refunds for temporal paradoxes, existential crises, or spontaneous transmogrification. Bring your own container. Reginald's grin widened. This, he thought, would be the production that would put the players of unlikely fortune on the map, though he didn't specify which map, or indeed which dimension the map might exist in. Outside the window, a small bird suddenly turned inside out, then right, side in again, and flew away slightly confused but otherwise unharmed. Nobody noticed. The improbability had begun. Chapter 2. The rehearsal room at the end of the universe. The rehearsal room of the players of unlikely fortune had seen many things in its time. It had witnessed interpretive dances based on tax legislation, a one-man show about the life cycle of the common earthworm, performed by a method actor who spent 6 months living in soil, and a musical adaptation of the phone book that had been surprisingly well received, particularly by people whose names featured in the chorus, but it had never seen anything quite like the object currently sitting in the centre of the room. The wormhole, if indeed that's what it was, resembled nothing so much as a hole that had gotten bored with the concept of being a hole and decided to explore other career options. It shimmered slightly, like heat rising from pavement, and occasionally made a sound that might have been described as WOP if the person describing it had recently suffered a concussion. Around this phenomenon, the cast of Hamlet was assembled, maintaining a respectful distance that suggested they weren't being paid enough to stand any closer. Archibald Archie Dent, the stage manager, was attempting to create a rehearsal schedule on his tablet. The document currently contained more question marks than actual words, and he had created a colour-coding system so complex that it had accidentally included colours that didn't exist in this particular reality. "Right," he said, looking up at the assembled actors with the haunted expression of a man who suspects his career has taken a wrong turn but can't quite pinpoint where. "Welcome to our first rehearsal for Hamlet. As you can see, Director Bottomsworth has incorporated a design element." "Is it supposed to be doing that?" asked Maximilian Max Probability, the reluctant actor cast as Hamlet, pointing at the wormhole, which had just briefly displayed what appeared to be a living room where a startled octopus was watching television. "Doing what?" asked Reginald, striding into the room with the confident air of someone who has no idea what they've gotten themselves into. "Ah, I see Gerald is settling in nicely." "Gerald?" echoed Felicity Quantum, the actress playing Ophelia, whose resume listed advanced degrees under special skills, but didn't specify in what. "The wormhole," Reginald explained, as if naming interdimensional anomalies was the most natural thing in the world. "The lighting technician named him. Apparently, they bonded during installation. "You can't bond with a wormhole," Max muttered, then added under his breath, "and you shouldn't name it like it's a pet goldfish." "I've prepared a rehearsal schedule," Archie interjected, holding up his tablet, "which includes contingency plans for standard theatrical emergencies such as forgotten lines, prop malfunctions, and potential interdimensional disruptions." He had added the last category as a joke, but was now beginning to suspect it might be the most relevant. "Excellent, excellent," Reginald said, not actually looking at the schedule. "Let's begin with Act 1, Scene 1. The guards on the battlements. Where are Francisco and Bernardo?" Two actors stepped forward, scripts in hand. "Wonderful. Now, I want you to imagine that the bitter cold of the Danish night is actually the cold of the void between dimensions. The ghost you're about to see isn't just the spirit of Hamlet's father, it's a manifestation of the collective unconscious of all possible Hamlets across the multiverse." The actors nodded, though their expressions suggested they would have nodded at anything just to get this over with. "And begin." Francisco cleared his throat. "Who's there?" At that precise moment, the script in his hand changed font, the text transforming from sensible Times New Roman to something that resembled hieroglyphics drawn by a caffeinated squirrel. He said, squinting at the page. "Line?" called Archie helpfully. "No, it's just my script has gone weird." Reginald waved this away. "The text is merely adapting to the quantum fluctuations in the room. Shakespeare's words exist in all possible variations simultaneously until observed. Basic quantum literature. Continue." Bernardo, whose script remained mercifully unchanged, picked up his cue. "Nay, answer me. Stand and unfold yourself." "Long live the king," Francisco managed, having deciphered his mutated text. As the scene progressed, small anomalies began to manifest around the rehearsal room. A coffee cup on the side table briefly contained orange juice, then coffee again. A chair lifted 2 inches off the ground, spun slowly, and settled back down. No one commented on these occurrences, operating under the universal theatrical principle that if you don't acknowledge a problem, you don't have to solve it. By the time they reached the entrance of the ghost, the anomalies had escalated. The actor playing the ghost entered right on cue, but was wearing a costume that no one recognized, a sort of shimmering toga that occasionally displayed what appeared to be stock market quotes from the year 2247. "Look where it comes again," Bernardo exclaimed with genuine alarm. The ghost opened its mouth to speak, but instead of the lines from the play, it said, "Is this thing on? Hello? Testing, testing. 1, 2, 3. Is this the right haunting? I was supposed to be at a séance in Poughkeepsie." Everyone turned to look at Reginald, who was beaming as if this was exactly what he had envisioned. "Brilliant improvisation," he declared. The ghost as a confused entity, unsure of its purpose or placement in the cosmic order. "Keep going." The rehearsal continued in this vein for another hour. Props appeared and disappeared. At one point, Horatio's monologue was delivered in perfect iambic pentameter, but described the rules of a complex card game played on a planet circling Alpha Centauri rather than anything related to Hamlet. Through it all, Reginald nodded enthusiastically, occasionally shouting directions like "more existential uncertainty" and "feel the quantum vibrations in your delivery." Archie had given up on his rehearsal schedule and was now simply making tick marks on his tablet every time something impossible happened. He had run out of space. Felicity, meanwhile, was watching the wormhole with scientific fascination, occasionally taking notes in a small book she had produced from her pocket. Max, for his part, looked like a man who had signed up for a relaxing cruise and found himself on a pirate ship. As they wrapped up the first scene, the skull of Yorick which wasn't supposed to appear until Act 5, materialized on the centre table. Everyone stared at it. The skull's jaw clicked open, and in a voice that sounded like a maitre d' at a particularly exclusive restaurant, it said, "Knock, knock." After a long pause, Max, apparently deciding that someone had to maintain some semblance of normalcy, replied, "Who's there?" "Yorick," said the skull. "Yorick who? Yorick N really tell I've been dead a while, can't you?" The skull then proceeded to laugh at its own joke, a sound like dice being rattled in a tin can. Archie made another tick mark on his tablet. Reginald clapped his hands together. "Well, I think that's enough for today. Wonderful work, everyone. I can already tell this is going to be a production unlike any other." On this point, at least, no one could disagree. As the actors filed out, casting nervous glances at the wormhole, which was now showing what appeared to be a cooking show hosted by creatures with too many limbs, Archie approached Reginald. "Sir," he began, "I feel I should point out that there were some unusual occurrences during rehearsal." "Yes," Reginald exclaimed. "Wasn't it magnificent? The quantum uncertainty principle applied to theatrical performance. We're breaking new ground here, Archie. We're breaking something," Archie muttered. "Sir, do you think it's safe to have Gerald in the rehearsal room?" "Safe?" Reginald looked genuinely puzzled. "Art isn't about safety, Archie. It's about risk, about pushing boundaries, about expanding the very concept of what theatre can be." "Yes, but most boundary pushing doesn't involve actual holes in the fabric of reality. That we know of," Reginald countered. "Who's to say what methods the great innovators of the past might have employed? Perhaps Shakespeare himself had a small wormhole. It would explain the historical inconsistencies in his history plays." Archie opened his mouth to argue further, then closed it again. He had worked with Reginald long enough to know when he was fighting a losing battle. "I'll update the rehearsal schedule," he said instead. "Should I include time for interdimensional anomalies?" "Better make it a flexible schedule," Reginald advised. "Time itself might become somewhat negotiable." As Archie left, shaking his head, Reginald turned to regard the wormhole. Gerald, with the fond expression of a parent watching a particularly gifted child. "We're going to make history," he told it, "or possibly unmake it. Either way, it's going to be spectacular." The wormhole made a sound that might have been agreement, or might have been the universe hiccuping. It was difficult to tell the difference. Chapter 3. Infinite Improbability Rehearsals. As the days passed, rehearsals for the players of Unlikely Fortunes' production of Hamlet settled into a routine that could only be described as routinely unpredictable. The cast had developed a sort of resigned adaptability to the situation, the kind usually seen in long-term residents of active volcanic islands or people who live with particularly temperamental cats. The wormhole, Gerald, had become more active, its influence spreading throughout. The rehearsal space like a peculiar form of interdimensional mould. Reality around the theatre had become, to use a technical term, squishy. On Tuesday, the ghost of Hamlet's father appeared right on cue, but instead of the expected spectre of Danish royalty, the apparition that materialized was a confused postman who had died in 1973. Said the ghost, looking around at the assembled actors. "This isn't Wisteria Lane. I've got a package for number 42. "You're supposed to be my father," hissed Max, who was becoming increasingly irritated with the production's departures from the text. "I very much doubt that," replied the ghost. "I never made it to Denmark. Farthest I got was Clacton-on-Sea for a bank holiday weekend. Rained the whole time." Reginald, who was watching from the side of the stage, leapt to his feet. "Yes, perfect. The ghost as a manifestation of mundane bureaucracy, forever trapped in the purgatory of undelivered mail. The existential horror of administrative limbo. The ghost looked at Reginald with the expression of someone who has accidentally walked into the wrong public restroom but is trying to play it cool. Right. Well, if anyone sees a package for number 42 Wisteria Lane, I'd appreciate it if you'd let me know. Been looking for it since 73. With that, he faded away, leaving behind a faint smell of stamp adhesive. Later that same day, during Polonius's famous advice to Laertes, something even stranger occurred. The actor playing Polonius began normally enough, yet here, Laertes, aboard for shame. The wind sits in the shoulder of your sail, and you are stayed for— But as he continued, his lines began to drift from Shakespeare's text into something altogether different. Neither a borrower nor a lender be, for loan oft loses both itself and friend, and borrowing dulls the edge of husbandry. This above all, ensure your spaceship's maintenance schedule is adhered to strictly, particularly the antimatter containment fields, which, if neglected, will cause your molecules to reverse polarity, and your internal organs to become briefly external, which is, I assure you, most uncomfortable. The actor stopped, blinking in confusion. I don't think that's right. It's perfect. Reginald shouted. The juxtaposition of Elizabethan wisdom with futuristic technical advice, the eternal nature of paternal guidance across the centuries. Keep going. The actor, whose name was Bernard, and who had taken this job because his therapist had suggested he try new things, a recommendation he now planned to discuss at length in their next session, hesitantly continued. Give every man thy ear, but few thy voice. Take each man's censure, but reserve thy judgment. Costly thy habit as thy purse can buy, but not expressed in fancy, rich, not gaudy. For the apparel oft proclaims the man, and they in France, of the best rank and station, are most select and generous in their choice of warp-drive configurations. By the end of the scene, Polonius had somehow delivered a comprehensive guide to interstellar travel, proper etiquette when meeting silicon-based life forms, and a recipe for something called quantum casserole that apparently existed in all possible states until eaten. Throughout all of this, Archie had been developing increasingly complex systems to cope with the anomalies. He now carried a set of coloured flags which he would raise to signal different types of reality disruptions, blue for temporal anomalies, red for spatial distortions, green for unexpected manifestations, and a special plaid flag for things too weird to categorize. The plaid flag was getting the most use. Felicity, meanwhile, had become fascinated by the wormhole. Between scenes, she could be found taking measurements with instruments she produced from a seemingly bottomless bag, muttering about quantum fluctuation patterns and interdimensional resonance frequencies. I think it's responding to dramatic tension, she announced during a break, looking up from a device that resembled a calculator that had mated with a small octopus. The more emotionally charged the scene, the more active the wormhole becomes. That makes sense. Reginald nodded sagely. Theatre has always been about energy exchange between performers and audience. Gerald is simply a more direct manifestation of that exchange. Gerald is a hole in reality that's turning our play into nonsense, Max muttered, flipping through his script, which now contained 3 different versions of To Be or Not to Be, including one that was exclusively about sandwiches. Not nonsense, Reginald corrected. Enhanced reality, expanded possibilities. Theatrical quantum superposition. Max looked like he wanted to expand the possibilities of Reginald's face meeting his fist. But he restrained himself. He had bills to pay, after all, and jobs for actors who specialised in looking brooding while delivering iambic pentameter weren't exactly plentiful. The rehearsal continued, with the wormhole, Gerald, becoming increasingly involved in the proceedings. It had developed preferences. It liked the soliloquies, but got bored during exposition. It enjoyed the actor playing Horatio, but seemed to have a personal vendetta against the one playing Rosencrantz, whose shoelaces kept untying themselves whenever he spoke. Most notably, Gerald had developed a peculiar relationship with the lighting board. The lighting technician, a taciturn woman named Susan, who had seen enough strange things in her theatrical career that a sentient wormhole barely registered on her weirdness scale, reported that Gerald seemed to be flirting with her equipment. "The board keeps changing its settings," she explained during a production meeting, "but not randomly. How do I put this? It's making the lights more flattering. Everyone looks better. The shadows are more dramatic. The highlights are more luminous. Gerald has good taste," Reginald declared, "and clearly an eye for lighting design. It left me flowers," Susan added. "Or, well, something like flowers. They're purple, and they hum when you water them." Archie made a note to add possible interdimensional flora to his hazard list. By the end of the week, the production had evolved, or devolved, depending on one's perspective, into something that bore only a passing resemblance to Shakespeare's Hamlet. The basic structure remained, but the details had become fluid, changing from rehearsal to rehearsal like a dream that refuses to be pinned down upon waking. The gravedigger scene now included a detailed explanation of quantum physics, delivered by a gravedigger who occasionally spoke in equations rather than words. Ophelia's mad scene featured flowers that transformed into small aquatic mammals that sang in perfect harmony. And Hamlet's confrontation with his mother included a 3-minute tangent about the proper way to prepare tea in zero gravity. Through it all, Reginald maintained his enthusiasm, interpreting each bizarre occurrence as a stroke of artistic genius for which he was somehow responsible. "We're breaking new ground," he would declare after particularly strange rehearsals, while Archie, quietly, added new categories to his flag system, and Felicity took more measurements. Max, for his part, had developed a strange ability to remember all versions of the script simultaneously, which gave him a perpetual headache and the disconcerting sensation that he was performing multiple plays at once. "I think I'm becoming quantum entangled with the character," he confessed to Felicity during a break. "Yesterday I found myself contemplating the existential implications of sandwich fillings for 20 minutes. "Fascinating," Felicity replied, adjusting a dial on one of her instruments. "The wormhole might be creating a field of narrative uncertainty. All possible versions of Hamlet existing simultaneously, with you as the focal point. Is that dangerous?" "Probably not," she said, in the tone of someone who meant I have absolutely no idea. "Just try not to make any definitive decisions about being or not being. The wormhole might take it literally." As they spoke, Archie approached, looking more harried than usual. "Has anyone seen the backstage area recently?" he asked. "Not since yesterday," Max replied. "Why?" "It's changed. There's a corridor that wasn't there before. It leads to a tea room." "A tea room?" Felicity's interest was piqued. "What kind of tea room?" "The kind that serves you drinks before you order them," Archie said. "I walked in and found a cup of Earl Grey waiting for me, with exactly the amount of milk I prefer, and a biscuit. The chocolate kind with the orange bits that I like but can never find in shops." "Gerald is expanding his influence," Felicity nodded. "The wormhole is reshaping the theatre according to some internal logic we don't yet understand." "The wormhole is not a he," Max insisted. "It's an it. an anomaly, a problem. At that moment, the skull of Yorick materialized on the table beside them. Its jaw clicked open. "Why did the quantum physicist cross the road?" it asked. The three of them stared at it. Because he wasn't sure which side he was on. The skull cackled at its own joke, then added, "Tough crowd. You should hear my material about string theory." Archie raised his plaid flag without a word. As the skull continued its impromptu comedy routine, Reginald burst into the room, his eyes wild with excitement. "Wonderful news," he announced. "The final dress rehearsal is scheduled for tomorrow, and we've got a full house for opening night the day after. Critics, patrons, the works. But we haven't had a single complete run-through that resembles the actual play," Archie pointed out. "Details, details," Reginald waved dismissively. "The universe rewards boldness, Archie, and our production is nothing if not bold." As if to emphasize this point, the wormhole pulsed, and all the chairs in the room briefly turned into toadstools before returning to normal. "See?" Reginald gestured triumphantly. "Gerald agrees with me." Archie, Felicity, and Max exchanged glances. None of them pointed out that having a wormhole agree with you was not generally considered a mark in the win column of rational decision-making. "I'll update the rehearsal schedule." Archie sighed, pulling out his tablet. "Should I include time for spontaneous furniture transmutation?" "Better make it a flexible schedule," Reginald advised, "not for the first time. Very, very flexible." As Reginald swept out of the room, already planning his opening night speech, the remaining three looked at each other with the shared expression of people who have found themselves on a runaway train and are trying to decide whether to apply the brakes or simply enjoy the view before the inevitable crash. "Well," said Felicity finally, "at least it won't be boring." "To be fair," Max admitted, "I've always thought Hamlet could use more quantum physics and talking skulls. And interdimensional tea rooms," Archie added. The skull of Yorick chose that moment to deliver the punchline to a joke. No one had heard the setup for, and then the neutron said, "For free? I'm not made of money." It laughed alone, but somehow that made it funnier. Chapter 4. Mostly harmless anomalies. By the time the final dress rehearsal arrived, the theatre had transformed in ways that would have fascinated architects, confounded physicists, and sent insurance adjusters running for the hills, possibly screaming. The building now contained corridors that led to rooms that couldn't possibly fit within the original dimensions. Doors opened onto spaces that seemed to exist in different time zones, or possibly different dimensions altogether. The women's dressing room now had a window that showed a breathtaking view of Saturn's rings, while the men's featured a perpetually running shower that dispensed not water, but a lavender-scented liquid that left users feeling existentially refreshed, whatever that meant. Most of the cast and crew had adapted to these changes with a remarkable resilience of theatre people who are generally accustomed to working in buildings with questionable heating, mysterious leaks, and at least one ghost. The addition of spatial anomalies and occasional violations of the laws of physics were merely new entries on the list of things to complain about during cigarette breaks. Archie had developed his flag system into something resembling a small naval communication centre. He now carried a bandolier of differently coloured flags across his chest, like a revolutionary soldier, ready to signal at a moment. Notice whether the current anomaly was temporal, spatial, biological, or potentially apocalyptic, but in a theatrical way. He had also created a series of hand signals for the stage crew, a complex system that could convey messages like the props are. Melting again. Someone's costume is evolving sentience, and don't panic, but there's a small black hole near the light board. Felicity had transformed a corner of the green room into a makeshift laboratory. filled with instruments of her own design that measured various aspects of what she now called the Gerald effect. She had charts tracking the correlation between dramatic tension and reality fluctuations, graphs showing the increasing radius of Gerald, its influence, and a small terrarium containing samples of the strange humming flowers that kept appearing in unexpected places. Max, for his part, had developed a sort of resigned acceptance of his situation. He now carried a towel with him at all times, having read somewhere that this was advisable when dealing with interdimensional travel. He also kept a notebook in which he recorded the various versions of his soliloquies, which now numbered in the dozens and ranged from the traditional Shakespearean text to an extended meditation on sandwich fillings, to a complex mathematical proof that seemed to demonstrate that existence itself was optional. The final dress rehearsal began at precisely 7 p.m, or at least it was 7 p.m. on most of the watches in the theatre. Susan's digital watch insisted it was 11:15, while the antique grandfather clock that had mysteriously appeared in the lobby steadfastly maintained it was 1783. "Places, everyone," Archie called, waving a blue and yellow checkered flag that indicated beginning of rehearsal, standard temporal flow, hopefully to be maintained. The actors took their positions. The first scene began smoothly enough, with Francisco and Bernardo on the battlements. Their lines remained more or less intact, though Francisco's uniform now included epaulets that glowed in the dark and occasionally whispered stock tips. The entrance of the ghost, still the confused postman rather than Hamlet's father, went as expected, with his now familiar complaints about the undelivered package for number 42 Wisteria Lane. The audience, consisting of Reginald, Archie, and a few crew members, had grown fond of the postman and his eternal quest, and there was a smattering of applause as he faded away, leaving behind his customary scent of stamp adhesive. It was during the second scene, featuring Claudius and Gertrude addressing the court, that things began to go properly weird. The actor playing Claudius began his speech normally, though yet of Hamlet our dear brother's death, the memory be green, and that it us befitted, to bear our hearts in grief, and our whole kingdom, to be contracted in one brow of woe. But as he continued, his lines began to shift. The words remained Shakespearean in style, but the content veered dramatically. Yet now, methinks, I must address a matter most peculiar, that being the strange hole in reality's fabric that doth sit upon our stage like some unwelcome guest who brings not wine or bread, but chaos to the dinner table of our play. The actor paused, looking down at his script in confusion, but the words on the page had changed to match what he'd just said. He continued, now fully improvising, "This wormhole, which some have named Gerald, most presumptuous, doth twist our words and bend our very thoughts, making mockery of Shakespeare's text and driving our poor stage manager to fits of flag-waving most enthusiastic yet desperate." At this, Archie, who had been frantically waving his unscripted reality commentary, flags striped purple and orange, froze mid-wave, looking embarrassed. Claudius pressed on, "What say you, gentle audience, to this cosmic interruption? Shall we embrace the quantum possibilities it offers, or stick steadfast to the bard's intended words, like sailors clinging to familiar shores while ignoring the vast and strange new oceans that beckon?" There was a moment of silence, and then, to everyone's surprise, Gerald, the wormhole, pulsed with a soft light that somehow conveyed the impression of applause. Reginald leapt to his feet. Yes, magnificent. The play becoming aware of its own quantum uncertainty, the characters acknowledging the wormhole's presence. This is exactly what I envisioned. It was not, of course, what he had envisioned, as no human mind could, have envisioned the particular brand of chaos that was unfolding, but Reginald had developed a remarkable ability to retroactively claim that whatever happened was his artistic intention all along. The rehearsal continued, each scene veering further from Shakespeare's text while maintaining a strange, dreamlike coherence of its own. Ophelia's mad scene now included her floating near the ceiling, reciting perfect iambic pentameter that somehow explained string theory. Laertes' return from France featured him describing in great detail a Paris that included flying buttresses that actually flew and a Seine river that flowed with something that wasn't quite water but made excellent coffee. The gravedigger scene had transformed entirely. The gravediggers now appeared to be quantum physicists, discussing the theoretical implications of Schrödinger's cat while digging what they described as a grave for classical determinism. "Alas, poor Yorick," Max intoned, right on cue, holding up the skull which winked at him. "I knew him, Horatio, a fellow of infinite jest, of most excellent fancy. He hath borne me on his back 1,000 times, and now how abhorred in my imagination it is! My gorge rises at it. Here hung those lips that I have kissed I know not how oft. Where be your gibes now, your gambols, your songs, your flashes of merriment, that were wont to set the table on a roar?" The skull's jaw clicked open. "I'm right here, mate, and for the record, you never kissed me. I think I'd remember that." Max, to his credit, didn't miss a beat. Even in death, his wit remains, though now tinged with the existential awareness that comes from having one's flesh rendered from one's bones by the indifferent processes of decomposition. "Bit dramatic," the skull commented. "It wasn't that bad, more like a really intense exfoliation. By the time they reached the final scene, with its famous duel between Hamlet and Laertes, reality had become so fluid that the weapons kept changing mid-fight. One moment they were fencing with traditional foils, the next with lightsabers, then with oversized novelty pencils, then with what appeared to be frozen herrings. The deaths, when they came, were spectacular. Gertrude, upon drinking the poisoned wine, transformed temporarily into a small constellation of stars before reforming as herself, lying motionless on the stage. Laertes, struck by the poisoned herring, or possibly pencil, it had changed again mid-strike, delivered his final lines in perfect Shakespearean verse, but in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Claudius, run through by Hamlet, exploded into a shower of small, colourful birds that flew around the theatre once before vanishing through the wormhole, and Hamlet, in his death scene, somehow managed to deliver the rest is silence in a way that made actual silence fall across the theatre, a profound, perfect quiet that seemed to exist not just as an absence of sound, but as a positive presence of its own. For a full minute after the final tableau, no one moved or spoke. The silence held, rich and strange. Then Gerald pulsed once, twice, 3 times, like applause. The spell broke. Reginald was on his feet, tears streaming down his face. "Magnificent!" he cried. "Transcendent! This is not just theatre, this is the future of theatre. The quantum future." The actors rose, looking dazed, as if waking from a shared dream. They bowed automatically, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought had abandoned them. Archie stood at the back, his flags hanging limply at his sides. He had run out of signals halfway through the performance and had resorted to simply staring, open-mouthed, as reality rewrote itself before his eyes. Felicity was scribbling frantically in her notebook, her instruments forgotten. Whatever data she was recording seemed to require words rather than measurements now. "Tomorrow," Reginald announced, his voice ringing through the theatre, "we share this revolution with the world." Tomorrow we make history. No one pointed out that they might, in fact, be unmaking history, or at least bending it into shapes it was never meant to assume. As the cast dispersed, still moving like sleepwalkers, Max approached Felicity and Archie. "Did that make any sense to you?" he asked. "Not even slightly," Archie admitted. "It made a different kind of sense," Felicity said thoughtfully. "A non-linear, non-rational sense. Like dream logic, but more mathematical. I delivered a soliloquy about sandwiches that somehow connected to the nature of existence," Max said, "and it felt profound while I was saying it." "It was profound," Felicity assured him. "Something about the choice between ham and cheese being a metaphor for the fundamental binary choices that define our reality." "Right," Max nodded. "That's exactly what I meant." "Definitely." Archie looked between them, then at his collection of flags, and finally at the wormhole, which was pulsing gently in the centre of the stage like a contented cat. "We're going to do this again tomorrow, in front of actual people, critics and patrons and normal humans?" "Apparently," Max said. "With money?" Archie pressed. "Real money that they've paid." "That's generally how theatre works," Felicity confirmed. Archie considered this for a moment. "I should make more flags," he decided finally. "Many more flags." As they left the theatre, none of them noticed that the building no longer quite matched its external dimensions. It was subtly larger on the inside, and certain windows showed views that couldn't possibly exist in their particular location, or indeed on Earth at all. In the empty theatre, Gerald pulsed contentedly. The wormhole had developed a taste for drama, and tomorrow promised to be very dramatic indeed. The skull of Yorick, left on a prop table, chuckled softly to itself. "To be or not to be," it murmured. "That's not even the right question anymore." Chapter 5. So long, and thanks for all the soliloquies. The morning of the final dress rehearsal dawned bright and clear, or at least it was bright and clear somewhere in the universe. Outside the theatre, the weather had developed a peculiar localized condition that meteorologists would have been fascinated by, had any of them been brave enough to approach the building. A small cloud, roughly the size and shape of a moderately successful accountant, hovered exclusively over the theatre's main entrance. It was raining, but the raindrops fell upward, returning to the cloud instead of hitting the ground. Occasionally a drop would pause mid-trajectory, as if reconsidering its life choices before continuing its reverse journey. Inside, the cast and crew were going through their pre-rehearsal rituals, each of which had evolved to incorporate the new quantum reality of their workplace. The actor playing Horatio was gargling with a liquid that changed colour every time he hit a particular note. The actress playing Gertrude was applying makeup that occasionally applied itself when she wasn't looking. The stagehands were checking props that had developed the disconcerting habit of being in two places simultaneously. Archie, now sporting a bandolier containing no fewer than 37 differently coloured and patterned flags, was attempting to coordinate it all with the grim determination of a man who has accepted that insanity is his new normal. "Places in 10 minutes," he called, waving a flag that was half blue, half green, with a pattern of small yellow ducks, the universal signal for final dress rehearsal with potential reality distortions, but please try to stick to the script anyway. Max sat in his dressing room, staring at his reflection in a mirror that occasionally showed him as he might appear in alternate universes. Currently, it was displaying a version of himself with a magnificent purple beard and what appeared to be gills. "To be or not to be," he murmured, trying to centre himself in the traditional text. "That is the question." The mirror Max's beard wiggled in apparent disagreement. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, his reflection morphed again, now showing him in what appeared to be a spacesuit made entirely of recycled tea bags, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing, end them. The mirror clouded over, then cleared to show his normal reflection, which was something of a relief. Max had been halfway convinced he'd sprout a beard or gills himself at any moment. A knock at his door interrupted his concentration. "Come in," he called. Felicity entered, carrying what looked like a small colander with fairy lights attached to it. "I've been working on this," she said without preamble. "It might help stabilize the quantum fluctuations around you specifically. Is it safe?" Max eyed the device suspiciously. "Define safe," Felicity replied, which was not the reassuring answer Max had hoped for. "Will it explode, implode, cause me to merge with my alternate selves, or turn me into a penguin?" Max clarified. "Almost certainly not," Felicity said, with the confidence of someone making an educated guess rather than stating a scientific certainty. "It should create a small bubble of relative stability around you. Your lines might still change, but at least you'll physically remain in this dimension." "That would be a nice change," Max admitted. The previous day, during a particularly intense scene with Claudius, he had briefly found himself delivering his lines from what appeared to be the surface of the moon. The acoustics had been terrible. Felicity placed the colander-like device on his head. It hummed softly and emitted a faint blue glow. "There. How does that feel?" "Like I'm wearing a kitchen utensil covered in Christmas lights," Max said dryly. "Perfect. That means it's working." Felicity adjusted something on the side of the device. "The quantum stabilization field should extend about 6 inches from your body in all directions. Not much, but better than nothing. Thanks, I think." Max stood, careful not to dislodge his new headgear. "How bad do you think today is going to be?" Felicity considered this question with the seriousness it deserved. "Well, Gerald has been getting stronger. The wormhole's influence now extends throughout the entire theatre. I've detected quantum fluctuations in the lobby, the bathrooms, even the ticket booth." "That doesn't answer my question." "I know." Felicity smiled apologetically. "The truth is, I have no idea. The variables are too numerous, but based on the increasing pattern of anomalies, I'd say we should expect something spectacular." "Spectacular," Max repeated flatly. "Wonderful." Another knock at the door heralded the arrival of Archie, who took one look at Max's headgear and didn't even blink. After the past few days, a man wearing a colander with lights was practically mundane. 5 minutes to places, he announced. "Reginald wants everyone on stage for a final pep talk." "Is that wise?" Max asked. "Getting everyone in one place near the wormhole?" Archie shrugged. Wisdom left the building around the time the bathroom sinks started dispensing Earl Grey tea instead of water. "I'm just passing along the message." The 3 of them made their way to the stage, where the rest of the cast was already gathering. Gerald, the wormhole, pulsed gently at centre stage, occasionally displaying brief glimpses of other realities. A desert landscape with 3 suns, an underwater city populated by creatures with too many, tentacles, a suburban kitchen where a family of what appeared to be sentient houseplants was having breakfast. Reginald stood before the assembled company, his eyes gleaming with the special madness that comes from either artistic genius or having one's brain slightly scrambled by proximity to a tear in the fabric of reality. With Reginald, it had always been difficult to tell the difference, and recent events had not made the distinction any clearer. "My friends, my fellow artists," he began, spreading his arms wide as if to embrace them all. "Today we stand on the precipice of theatrical history. What we have created here is not merely a production of Hamlet, it is a quantum interpretation, a multi-dimensional exploration of Shakespeare's text that transcends the limitations of traditional performance. No one pointed out that what they had created bore about as much resemblance to Shakespeare's Hamlet as a bicycle bears to a submarine. Both might technically be vehicles, but the similarities ended there. Today's final dress rehearsal is our last chance to refine our vision. Before we share it with the world tomorrow night, Reginald continued, I want you all to embrace the quantum possibilities, to flow with the changes rather than resist them. If your lines transform, speak them with conviction. If reality shifts around you, incorporate it into your performance. If you find yourself temporarily existing in multiple states simultaneously, use it to explore the duality of your character. Archie raised a small white flag, the universal signal for practical question amid the madness. Yes, Archie. Reginald acknowledged. What about the technical aspects? Lighting, sound, set changes? Everything keeps shifting? Improvise, Reginald declared, as if this were the solution to all problems, theatrical and otherwise. Susan has developed a remarkable rapport with the lighting board, despite, or perhaps because of, its newfound sentience. Our sound technician has embraced the fact that his equipment occasionally broadcasts signals from other dimensions. And as for the set, he gestured to the stage around them, which was indeed shifting subtly even as they watched. Walls, changing colour, and furniture rearranging itself like restless pets seeking comfortable positions. The set, Reginald continued, has become a living participant in our production, a dynamic environment that responds to the emotional truth of each scene. This was one way of describing a stage that had developed a mind of its own. Another way might have been terrifying or physically impossible or a clear violation of several laws of physics, but Reginald had never been one to dwell on such technicalities. Now, places everyone, let us make theatrical magic, or possibly tear a few more holes in the space-time continuum. Either way, it's going to be memorable. The cast dispersed to their starting positions with the resigned air of soldiers heading into battle. Battle against logic, conventional reality, and the text of one of the most famous plays ever written. The final dress rehearsal began. At first, things proceeded with surprising normality. The opening scene on the battlements unfolded much as it had the day before, with Francisco and Bernardo exchanging their lines while the ghost of the confused postman made his now familiar appearance. It was during the court scene that the first major anomaly occurred. As Claudius addressed the court, the actor found himself delivering not Shakespeare's lines about his hasty marriage to Gertrude, but a detailed and surprisingly technical explanation of knitting patterns. The pearl stitch, when executed with proper tension, he intoned with regal gravity, creates a texture most pleasing to both eye and hand. One must be vigilant, however, against the dropping of stitches which can unravel. One's work, much as a hasty murder, can unravel one's conscience. This last line created a tenuous connection to the actual plot, which the actor seized upon gratefully, steering his improvisation back toward the themes of guilt and murder that were supposed to be central to his character. The scene continued in this vein, with the actors valiantly attempting to maintain some connection to the original story while their lines transformed into discussions of knitting, quantum physics, proper tea brewing techniques, and in one memorable instance, a detailed review of a restaurant that wouldn't be opened for another 147 years. As they moved into Hamlet's first soliloquy, Max stepped forward, the colander on his head glowing slightly brighter. The quantum stabilization field seemed to be working. He remained firmly in this dimension, even as the set around him shifted and changed. "Oh, that this too solid flesh would melt," he began, and was pleasantly surprised when the words came out as written. His relief was short-lived, however. "Thaw, and resolve itself into a dew," he continued, but then the text shifted beneath him like quicksand, or perhaps into a sandwich. Yes, a sandwich seems preferable to dew, more substantial, with good bread, sourdough, not that pre-sliced nonsense, and proper filling, ham perhaps, or cheese, or both, ham and cheese, the eternal duality, the sweet and salt, the pink and yellow, united in perfect culinary harmony between slices of sourdough that represent the boundaries of our mortal existence. Max paused, momentarily thrown by the passion with which he'd just delivered an ode to sandwiches. The strange thing was, it had felt profound while he was saying it, as if he were, indeed, touching on some fundamental truth about existence through the metaphor of lunch meats. He pressed on, trying to return to the original text. How weary, stale, flat, and unprofitable seemed to me all the uses of this world. But again the words transformed. How weary, stale, flat, and unprofitable seemed to me all sandwiches made with inferior ingredients. Fie on't? Ah, fie! 'Tis an untoasted bread that lacks both butter and proper filling, a culinary abomination that offends both palate and soul. By the time he finished the soliloquy, he had somehow connected the existential despair of Hamlet to the existential despair of a poorly made sandwich in a way that, against all logic, made perfect emotional sense. There wasn't a dry eye in the house, though whether the tears were from emotional impact or suppressed laughter was difficult to determine. The rehearsal continued, each scene veering further from Shakespeare's text while maintaining a strange internal logic of its own. The famous to be or not to be soliloquy became a philosophical exploration of whether one should eat a sandwich or not eat a sandwich, which somehow circled back to questions of existence, mortality, and the afterlife through the metaphor of digestive processes. Ophelia's mad scene now featured actual flowers that transformed into small singing mammals, which harmonized beautifully on a song about the fragility of love and the proper care of garden perennials. The actress playing Ophelia, to her credit, incorporated these musical creatures into her performance seamlessly, as if deranged floristry had always been a key component of the character. The gravedigger scene reached new heights of absurdity when the gravediggers began digging not with shovels, but with what appeared to be mathematical equations that somehow physically moved the earth. They discussed not the nature of death and burial, but the quantum nature of existence itself, occasionally pausing to demonstrate principles with small, localized violations of physics that left smoking holes in the stage floor. Throughout it all, Gerald, the wormhole, pulsed and shimmered at the centre of the stage occasionally, expanding to swallow props, only to return them moments later, slightly altered. A cup would come back with a different handle, a sword would return with its blade now made of what appeared to be solidified light, a crown would emerge encrusted with gems that changed colour depending on the moral quality of the lines being spoken. By the time they reached the final duel between Hamlet and Laertes, reality had become so fluid that the weapons changed with each pass. Foils became light, sabres became oversized, pencils became fish, became mathematical theorems given physical form. The actors fenced not just with their bodies, but with concepts, each thrust and parry representing a philosophical position that clashed with its opposite. Gertrude's death by poisoned wine was particularly spectacular. Upon drinking, the actress froze in mid-motion, then slowly transformed into a constellation of stars that hovered in human shape before collapsing back into her physical form as she delivered her final lines. Claudius, run through by Hamlet's weapon, which at that moment appeared to be a rolled-up copy of the Financial Times from 3 years in the future, exploded not into birds as he had the day before, but into a shower of small, brightly coloured fish that flopped around the stage briefly before vanishing through the wormhole, and Hamlet's death, Max's final scene, transcended even the strangeness that had come before. As he delivered his final line, "The rest is silence," the theatre was indeed plunged into perfect silence, but it was a silence that had texture and depth, a silence that felt not like an absence of sound, but like a positive presence of its own, a silence that somehow communicated more than words ever could. For a full minute after the final tableau, no one moved or spoke. Reginald was on his feet, tears streaming down his face. "Magnificent!" he cried. Chapter 6. Life, the Universe, and Opening Night. Opening night arrived with the kind of weather that meteorologists dream about, not because it was particularly pleasant, but because it defied every known principle of atmospheric science and would have made for a fascinating research paper had any meteorologist been brave enough to approach the theatre. Above the building, clouds had formed into shapes that clouds had no business forming, perfect cubes, dodecahedrons, and what appeared to be a detailed reproduction of the Mona Lisa, if the Mona Lisa had been smiling broadly and giving a thumbs-up. Rain fell intermittently, sometimes upward, sometimes sideways, and occasionally in colours not normally associated with water. Inside the theatre, chaos reigned, but it was the organised chaos familiar to anyone who has ever been backstage before an opening night, amplified, of course, by the quantum anomalies that had become business as usual for the players of unlikely fortune. Archie, now sporting not just his bandolier of flags, but also a helmet, equipped with small semaphore arms, was coordinating the final preparations with the grim determination of a general. Before a battle he knows he cannot win, but is determined to fight anyway. "Lighting check," he called. Susan, at her sentient lighting board, gave a thumbs up. The lights dimmed, then brightened, then briefly turned a colour that had no name in any human language before settling into what seemed like a normal pre-show state. The lighting board made a sound that might have been a purr. "Sound check." The sound technician, a man named Derek, who had developed the 1,000-yard stare of someone who has heard things no human was meant to hear, nodded once. The speakers emitted a test tone that started normally but ended with what sounded like whale song performed by creatures that had never seen a whale and were working from a particularly inaccurate description. "Props check." The props master gestured to the collection of items arranged neatly on a table. Swords, cups, the skull of Yorick, which winked at Archie, and various other objects required for the performance. All seemed to be behaving themselves, although the cups were playing a quiet game of musical chairs when they thought no one was looking. "House opens in 15 minutes, Archie announced. "Places in 30. In the green room, the cast was going through their pre-show rituals, each of which had evolved to incorporate protective measures against quantum disruption. Max sat in his dressing room, the quantum stabilization colander humming softly on his head. He was reviewing his script, though at this point it was more of a formality than a practical exercise. The words would change once he was on stage, responding to Gerald's influence and the quantum fluctuations that now permeated the theatre. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called. Felicity entered, carrying what looked like a small handheld device that resembled a television remote crossed with a vegetable peeler. "I've been monitoring the wormhole," she said without preamble. "Its energy signature has increased by approximately 37% since yesterday." "Is that bad?" Max asked, though he was fairly certain he knew the answer. It's significant, Felicity replied diplomatically. Gerald seems to be responding to the anticipation of an audience. The wormhole is excited. An excited wormhole, Max repeated flatly. Wonderful. Just what we need. I've made some adjustments to your stabilizer, Felicity said, reaching out to tweak something on the colander. The humming increased slightly in pitch. This should help keep you anchored, but be prepared for increased anomalies tonight. More than we've already experienced. Max raised an eyebrow. What's left? The theatre transforming into a giant sandwich, the audience turning into penguins, Shakespeare himself rising from the grave to demand we cease and desist. All of those are theoretically possible. Felicity nodded seriously. Though the penguin transformation would require a specific quantum resonance that I don't think Gerald has quite mastered yet. That's not reassuring. It wasn't meant to be. Felicity smiled slightly. Just be prepared for anything. And I mean anything. Another knock heralded the arrival of Reginald, resplendent in a tuxedo that occasionally flickered to show different styles from various eras and possibly dimensions. At one moment it was a standard modern tuxedo, the next an Elizabethan doublet and hose, then briefly what appeared to be formal attire for a species with 3 arms and no neck. "My stars!" he exclaimed, using one of his theatrical affectations that had once seemed affected, but now seemed oddly appropriate given the cosmic nature of their situation. Opening night. The critics are arriving, the patrons are lining up, and I've just spotted what I believe might be 3 beings of pure energy in the lobby claiming to be Shakespeare enthusiasts. Beings of pure energy? Max repeated. Well, they're glowing slightly and hovering about 3 inches off the ground, Reginald clarified. They've purchased tickets and program books, though, so I see no reason to discriminate. The arts are for everyone, corporeal or otherwise. Of course, Max murmured. How progressive of us. 5 minutes to places. Archie's voice echoed through the intercom system, followed by what sounded like a brief argument in an alien language before his voice returned. Sorry about that. The intercom system seems to have briefly connected to what I believe is a drive-through restaurant in another dimension. 5 minutes to places, everyone. Reginald clapped his hands together. This is it. The culmination of our artistic vision. Break a leg, both of you, though not literally, as our insurance specifically excludes quantum-related dismemberment or spontaneous transmogrification. With that cheerful disclaimer, he swept out of the room, leaving Max and Felicity to exchange a look. That contained equal parts resignation, terror, and the peculiar exhilaration that comes from knowing one is about to participate in something truly unprecedented, for better or worse. Well, Max said, adjusting his colander one last time, into the breach. Or the wormhole, Felicity added with a small smile. The audience that had gathered for the opening night of the Players of Unlikely, Fortune's production of Hamlet was, to put it mildly, eclectic. In the front rows sat the theatre critics, notebooks and tablets at the ready, their faces arranged in the professionally neutral expressions of people who have seen everything and are prepared to be unimpressed by anything. Behind them were the wealthy patrons and donors, dressed in their finest jewellery, glinting in the strange light that now filled the theatre, light that occasionally shifted in colour and intensity for no apparent reason, sometimes, illuminating people who weren't actually there before returning to normal. Scattered throughout were regular theatre-goers, Shakespeare enthusiasts, and the merely curious, who had been drawn by the increasingly bizarre rumours circulating about the production. And yes, in the back row, Three beings of pure energy hovered slightly above their seats, their glow pulsing gently as they perused their program books with appendages that weren't quite hands. As the house lights dimmed, after briefly brightening to supernova intensity and then cycling through several colours not visible to the human eye, a hush fell over the audience. The stage remained dark for a moment longer than was customary, as if the very fabric of reality was taking a deep breath before the plunge. Then, light. The battlements of Elsinore appeared, though keen-eyed observers might have noticed that the stones occasionally rearranged themselves when no one was looking directly at them, and that the stars visible in the backdrop didn't correspond to any known constellation in Earth's sky. Francisco and Bernardo took their positions, and the play began. "Who's there?" Francisco called, his voice steady despite the fact that his uniform was subtly changing colour with each word. "Nay, answer me," Bernardo replied. "Stand and unfold yourself." The opening scene proceeded with surprising normality, the actors delivering their lines as written, the staging conventional. The audience began to relax, perhaps wondering if the rumours had been exaggerated. Then the ghost appeared. Instead of the expected spectre of Hamlet's father, the confused postman materialised, looking around with the expression of someone who has taken a wrong turn at Albuquerque and ended up in a dimension not his own. "Oh, not again," he sighed, visible and audible to the entire audience. "Still looking for number 42 Wisteria Lane. Has anyone seen my package?" The audience stirred, uncertain whether this was an avant-garde interpretation or a genuine mistake. The critics in the front row began scribbling furiously. Horatio, to his credit, improvised brilliantly. "What art thou, spirit? Some messenger from realms beyond, bearing tidings not of royal murder but of mundane postal duties?" "I'm just a postman," the ghost replied. "Died in 73. Heart attack on my route. Been trying to deliver this package ever since." He held up a parcel that hadn't been visible a moment before. "Special delivery for number 42. Very important, apparently." The scene continued in this vein, with the guards and Horatio attempting to extract information about Hamlet's father from a ghost, who knew nothing about Danish royalty but had strong opinions about the deterioration of postal services in the afterlife. As the scene ended and the ghost faded away, leaving behind his customary scent of stamp adhesive, the audience was divided. Some looked confused, others intrigued, and a few were already suppressing laughter, sensing that this was not going to be the Hamlet they had expected. The court scene began, with Claudius and Gertrude addressing the assembled nobles. The actor playing Claudius started conventionally enough. "Though yet of Hamlet our dear brother's death, the memory be green, and that it us befitted, to bear our hearts in grief and our whole kingdom, to be contracted in one brow of woe." But as he continued, his lines began to shift, veering into his now familiar discourse on knitting. "Yet now, methinks, I must address a matter most domestic, that being the proper tension one must maintain when purling, for too loose a stitch doth lead to shapeless garments, while too tight a grip doth make the fabric stiff and unyielding, much like a kingdom ruled with too severe a hand." The audience's confusion deepened. Some checked their programs, wondering if they had somehow wandered into an experimental production about fibre arts rather than Shakespeare's great tragedy. The critics, however, began to lean forward in their seats, sensing something unprecedented unfolding before them. One critic, a notoriously hard-to-please reviewer for a prestigious publication, was actually smiling, a sight so rare that her colleagues regarded it with more alarm than the increasingly bizarre performance. As the play progressed, the quantum anomalies escalated. Ophelia's scenes with Polonius featured flowers that transformed into small singing mammals. Hamlet's confrontation with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern somehow became a detailed discussion of proper tea brewing techniques, which nonetheless conveyed the themes of betrayal and surveillance central to that relationship. The to-be or not-to-be soliloquy, when it came, was the moment when the audience collectively realized that they were witnessing something truly unique. Whether brilliantly innovative or completely insane remained to be determined. Max stepped forward, the quantum stabilization colander humming softly beneath his carefully arranged hair. Gerald, the wormhole, pulsed gently at the center of the stage, its influence, reaching out to twist Shakespeare's most famous lines into new shapes. To be or not to be, Max began, his voice clear and strong. That is the question. So far, so conventional. The audience held its breath. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, and then the shift came, subtle at first, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them. To die, to sleep, no more, and by a sleep to say we end the heartache and the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to. The words remain Shakespeare's, but as Max continued, a strange transformation occurred. Without changing the text, he somehow conveyed that Hamlet was not contemplating suicide, but rather considering the existential implications of sandwich consumption. To die, to sleep, perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub, for in that sleep of death, what dreams may come, when we have shuffled off this mortal coil, must give us pause. Somehow, through inflection, gesture, and the quantum influence of Gerald, the mortal coil became a metaphor for a sandwich wrapper, the dreams that might come referring to digestive processes, and yet, most bizarrely, the soliloquy lost none of its philosophical weight. If anything, it gained a new dimension of meaning, connecting the mundane act of eating to the profound questions of existence and non-existence. The audience was rapt. Even those who had come expecting traditional Shakespeare were leaning forward, captivated by this strange new interpretation that should have been ridiculous but was somehow deeply moving. As Max finished the soliloquy, there was a moment of complete silence. And then something unprecedented happened. Mid-performance applause. It began with a single person, one of the energy beings in the back row, and spread until the entire theatre was applauding a sandwich theme to be or not to be that had, against all logic, touched them deeply. The play continued, each scene veering further from Shakespeare's text while maintaining a strange, dreamlike coherence of its own. The player's scene, in which a troupe of actors performs for the court, became particularly meta. When the actors within the play began commenting on the quantum nature of their own performance, what players are these, whose lines shift like sand beneath the tide? The player king asked, breaking the fourth wall. We perform a play within a play, but both plays are unstable, quantum entities existing in multiple states simultaneously. The audience, rather than being alienated by this self-referential turn, became even more engaged. They were no longer merely watching a play, they were participating in a unique theatrical experiment, a quantum performance that existed in dialogue with itself and its audience. As the famous closet scene between Hamlet and Gertrude began, reality itself seemed to bend around the performers. The set, which had been subtly shifting throughout, now transformed more dramatically. The walls of Gertrude's chamber became transparent at times, revealing glimpses of other scenes, other plays, other realities. The ghost of the postman appeared again, still searching for number 42 Wisteria Lane, now carrying a stack of mail that included what appeared to be interdimensional correspondence. The audience gasped as time itself seemed to flow backward during Act 4, with characters momentarily speaking their lines in reverse before the normal flow resumed. Some audience members found themselves experiencing the play non-linearly, glimpsing scenes that hadn't happened yet or revisiting moments that had already passed. A few patrons in the third row briefly transformed into different versions of themselves, older, younger, or from parallel timelines, where they had made different life choices before returning to normal. Blinking in confusion but not, strangely, particularly alarmed. The critics, who had begun the evening with their professional skepticism intact, were now scribbling notes with the frantic energy of people trying to document a shared hallucination before it faded. One critic had abandoned her notebook entirely and was simply staring, open-mouthed, as reality rewrote itself before her eyes. Another was laughing uncontrollably, though whether from genuine amusement or some kind of existential breakdown was difficult to determine. By the time the play reached its final scene, with the duel between Hamlet and Laertes, the theatre had transformed into something that no longer entirely existed in conventional three-dimensional space. The stage seemed to extend infinitely in certain directions while contracting impossibly in others. The audience found themselves somehow closer to the action than the physical dimensions of the theatre should have allowed, as if the space between their seats and the stage had folded in on itself. The duel was a kaleidoscope of absurdity, with weapons morphing at random, pool cues turned into rubber, chickens which transmogrified into bursts of confetti, which solidified into fragile glass vases that shattered into melodies played on kazoos. The combatants clashed not just with steel and wit, but with the very fabric of reality, each riposte and counter to riposte a manifestation of competing existential crises that threatened to consume them both. Some audience members later swore that during particularly intense exchanges, Max and the actor playing Laertes briefly transformed into pure energy, their human forms dissolving into patterns of light that continued the duel on a quantum level before resolving back into physical bodies. Gertrude's demise by toxic tea was a tableau of seary loveliness. As the poison took hold, the actress's body began to dissolve into a swarm of fluttering origami cranes, each one bearing a cryptic message in invisible ink, before reassembling in a blur of colour and motion as she spoke her final words. Her voice a haunting harmony of whispering glass shards and distant thunder. The audience gasped collectively, several people reaching out involuntarily, as if to touch the swans that had momentarily existed among them. Claudius, impaled by Hamlet's ever-morphing sword, which had temporarily manifested as a vinyl record, playing a dubious rendition of Who Let the Dogs Out, burst into a spectacular display of aquatic fireworks, transforming into a school of iridescent fish that darted across the stage, leaving trails of glittering stardust in their wake before being sucked into the wormhole with a faint echo of the William Tell overture played on kazoos. Several fish landed in the laps of front-row audience members, where they transformed into origami sculptures of themselves before dissolving into scraps of paper with fragments of Shakespearean text written on them, collectible souvenirs of a performance that defied documentation. And Hamlet's demise, Max's swan song, defied the laws of theatrical gravity. As he spoke his final words, "The rest is silence," the very fabric of reality seemed to unravel, revealing a void that was both abyssal and oddly comforting. The silence that followed was not so much a lack of sound as a presence, a palpable entity that wrapped itself around the audience like a shroud. For an eternal moment, time itself appeared to stand still. Then, like a heartbeat, The lights flickered in Morse code, spelling out a single, enigmatic message, "Encore." The audience erupted into applause that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, the sound echoing in ways that the theatre's acoustics couldn't explain. People were on their feet, some crying, some laughing, some simply staring in wonder at what they had witnessed. The actors rose for their bows, looking dazed but exhilarated. Max removed the quantum stabilization colander, holding it aloft like a trophy as he took his final bow. The audience roared its approval, either for his performance or for the fact that he had managed to maintain some semblance of human form throughout the quantum chaos. It was difficult to tell which, and it didn't really matter. As the curtain fell, after briefly turning into a flock of butterflies before remembering its proper form and function, the audience remained standing, the applause continuing far longer than was customary. The three beings of pure energy in the back row were glowing so brightly that they cast shadows on the ceiling, their light pulsing in time with the applause. Backstage, the cast and crew were in a state of euphoric shock. They embraced each other, laughed, cried, and occasionally had to help colleagues who were temporarily experiencing existence in multiple states simultaneously. Reginald was beside himself with joy, alternating between hugging everyone within reach and making grand pronouncements about the future of quantum theatre. "We've done it," he kept saying. "We've revolutionized the very concept of performance. This is just the beginning." Archie, his flags now hanging limply from his bandolier, looked shell-shocked but pleased. "It actually worked," he kept muttering. "It actually worked." Felicity was already taking measurements, her instruments recording the gradually stabilizing quantum field as Gerald's influence began to wane slightly in the aftermath of the performance. "Fascinating," she murmured. "The wormhole seems to have reached some kind of satiation point, like it fed on the dramatic energy and is now digesting." Max found himself surrounded by cast members offering congratulations and asking how he had managed to remain so centered throughout the performance. He patted the colander gratefully. "Quantum stabilization," he explained, "and a very high tolerance for absurdity developed over years of working in theatre." As the backstage celebration continued, the critics were filing out of the theatre, still trying to process what they had witnessed. Their reviews, when published the following day, would range from ecstatic proclamations of a new theatrical era to bewildered attempts to describe the indescribable to one notably brief review that consisted entirely of the words "I have no words" repeated 17 times. The audience dispersed slowly, many lingering in the lobby to discuss what they had seen, to reassure themselves that others had witnessed the same impossible things to ground themselves once more in conventional reality, or what passed for it in the immediate vicinity of the theatre, where the laws of physics were still taking a liberal approach to their usual duties. The three beings of pure energy were the last to leave, hovering briefly before the poster for the production, their glow pulsing in what seemed like approval before they departed, not through the doors, but by simply fading from this particular reality, presumably returning to wherever energy beings call home. Inside the empty theatre, Gerald pulsed contentedly at the centre of the stage. The wormhole had developed a taste for drama, and tonight's feast had been particularly satisfying. And somewhere in the multiverse, a confused postman continued his eternal search for number 42 Wisteria Lane, unaware that he had briefly been part of the most revolutionary production of Hamlet ever staged, or indeed of any play in any reality where theatre existed. The quantum play had been performed, the infinite improbability had manifested, and nothing in theatre would ever be quite the same again. Chapter 7. Don't panic, it's just Shakespeare. The morning after opening night, the theatre existed in a state that physicists might have called quantum superposition, and that everyone else called a bloody mess. Reality around the building had become so fluid that approaching it from different directions sometimes led to different versions of the same structure. From the north, it appeared to be a conventional theatre with perhaps slightly unusual architecture. From the east, it resembled something designed by M.C. Escher during a particularly ambitious fever dream. From the west, it occasionally wasn't there at all, replaced by a small garden where butterflies with tiny human faces recited sonnets to bewildered passers-by. Inside, the cast and crew of the Players of Unlikely Fortune were attempting to prepare for their second performance, a task complicated by the fact that the theatre's internal geography had become even more unpredictable overnight. Corridors no longer reliably connected the same rooms. Staircases sometimes led to different floors than they had the day before, and the green room had developed the disconcerting habit of relocating itself every 47 minutes exactly. Archie, whose stage management skills were being tested in ways no training could have prepared him for, had resorted to leaving trails of coloured tape to mark paths through the building, a strategy undermined by the fact that the tape sometimes rearranged itself into cryptic messages or crude drawings of what appeared to be interdimensional wildlife. Company meeting in the he began to announce over the intercom before realizing he had no idea where to gather everyone. Company meeting, wherever you happen to find a large concentration of your colleagues. He amended, just start walking and you'll probably end up somewhere with other people. This unorthodox approach proved surprisingly effective. Within 15 minutes, most of the cast and crew had converged on what had once been the rehearsal room, but now resembled a cross between a Victorian conservatory and the bridge of a futuristic spaceship, complete with exotic plants that swayed to music no one could hear and control panels that occasionally lit up, in sequences that might have been random or might have been operating something vital in another dimension. Reginald stood before the assembled company, beaming with the special madness of a man whose wildest artistic gamble had somehow paid off spectacularly. In his hand, he clutched a stack of newspaper reviews, printed on paper that occasionally rippled as if it were liquid. "My friends, my fellow quantum thespians," he began, spreading his arms wide, "we have done it. The reviews are in, and they are, well, they're certainly something." He held up the first newspaper. From the Times, the Players of Unlikely Fortune's production of Hamlet defies conventional criticism, as it appears to defy the laws of physics, narrative coherence, and possibly several local ordinances regarding reality manipulation. This reviewer found herself alternately entranced, bewildered, and concerned for her sanity. 5 stars, I think. It's difficult to be certain of anything anymore. A cheer went up from the company. Archie raised a flag that was half blue, half gold, the signal for critical acclaim with existential confusion. Reginald continued, from The Guardian, "What I witnessed last night either represents the future of theatre, or the collective hallucination of an audience that has somehow ingested a powerful psychedelic. Having ruled out the latter through blood tests this morning, I am forced to conclude that I have seen the theatrical equivalent of the Big Bang, a cosmic event that creates new possibilities from chaos. Also, at one point, I briefly had 3 arms, which was convenient for note-taking." Another cheer, louder this time. Several actors hugged each other, occasionally passing partially through each other's bodies due to lingering quantum effects. "And my personal favourite," Reginald said, holding up a final review from the notoriously heart-o-please critic at The Observer. "I have no words. I have no words. I have no words." This is repeated 17 times and constitutes the entirety of the review. The company erupted in laughter and applause. Even Max, who had maintained a certain skepticism throughout the process, couldn't help but smile. They had created something unprecedented, something that had left even professional wordsmiths speechless. "The box office reports that we are completely sold out for the entire run," Reginald announced. "In fact, we've had to add extra performances to accommodate the demand. It seems that word has spread about our little quantum experiment." "Little?" Archie muttered, as a potted plant near his elbow, temporarily transformed into a small penguin, looked around in confusion and then reverted to botanical form. "Now, I know there have been some challenges," Reginald continued, acknowledging reality with uncharacteristic directness. "The building's spatial properties have become somewhat fluid. Props have developed autonomous behaviours, and some of you may have experienced temporary quantum entanglement with your characters or with alternate versions of yourselves from parallel dimensions." This was met with nods of recognition. The actress playing Ophelia raised her hand. "I woke up this morning speaking Danish," she said. "I don't know Danish. At least I didn't before yesterday. I found myself knitting in my sleep," added the actor playing Claudius. "I completed an entire sweater without waking up. It has 3 arms. I can now make sandwiches appear by thinking about them," Max admitted. "But only ham and cheese on sourdough. Any other combination doesn't work." Reginald nodded, as if these were all perfectly reasonable developments. "These are simply the occupational hazards of quantum theatre, my friends. Embrace these new abilities. They are the gifts of Gerald." At the mention of the wormhole's name, a ripple of something like affection passed through the company. Despite the chaos it had caused, Gerald had become something of a mascot, a strange but integral member of their theatrical family. "Speaking of Gerald," Felicity spoke up, "I've been monitoring the wormhole's energy signature, and there's something you should all be aware of." She stepped forward, holding one of her mysterious devices, which was emitting a soft pulsing light in time with the wormhole's fluctuations. "Gerald is growing. The performance last night seems to have fed it somehow, accelerated its development. It's no longer just influencing our reality. It's beginning to create its own." A murmur of concern passed through the group. "What exactly does that mean?" Archie asked, already mentally designing new flags for this unprecedented situation. "It means," Felicity explained, "that during tonight's performance, we might experience even more significant reality fluctuations. The boundary between performance and, well, everything else is becoming increasingly permeable." "Isn't that dangerous?" asked the actor playing Horatio, who had maintained a relatively low profile throughout the production, but now felt compelled to voice the concern that was on many minds. "Dangerous?" Reginald repeated, as if the concept was entirely new to him. "Art is always dangerous, my dear fellow. That's what makes it art." "I think he means physically dangerous," Max clarified. "As in reality breaking down completely, possibly taking us with it." "Ah." Reginald paused, momentarily stymied by this pedestrian concern. "Well, Felicity, is it dangerous in that tediously literal sense?" Felicity considered the question with scientific seriousness. "Based on my calculations, there's approximately a 17% chance that the wormhole could create a cascading reality failure during tonight's performance." "Only 17%? Reginald brightened. "Those are excellent odds. I've worked with actors who had a higher chance of forgetting their lines." "A cascading reality failure," Felicity continued, apparently feeling. that the concept required elaboration could theoretically collapse the theatre into a singularity, creating a new universe with its own physical laws derived from the narrative logic of our performance. There was a moment of silence as everyone processed this information. "So," said the actress playing Gertrude slowly, "we might become our characters? Permanently? Or become a quantum superposition of ourselves and our characters?" Felicity nodded. "Or possibly transform into pure narrative energy. The mathematics are still theoretical." Another silence fell, heavier this time. "Well," said Max finally, "at least we'd go out with good reviews." This broke the tension, generating laughter that released some of the anxiety that had been building. Theatre people, by nature and necessity, were adaptable creatures. The show must go on, even if going on might involve transcending conventional existence. "I've made some adjustments to the quantum stabilization technology," Felicity said, holding up a box containing what looked like modified versions of Max's colander. "These should help anchor each of you more firmly to this reality during the performance. They're not as powerful as Max's original device, but they should provide some protection." The cast members came forward to receive their stabilizers, which had been disguised as various character, appropriate headgear, crowns, caps, and in the case of the gravediggers, particularly elaborate wigs. "What about the audience?" Archie asked. "Ever practical. Should we warn them? Provide stabilizers?" Reginald waved this concern away. "The audience came for a transformative theatrical experience. Archie, it would be artistically dishonest to dilute that experience with warnings or protective gear. Besides," Felicity added, "the quantum effects are strongest on stage near Gerald. The audience should experience only minor reality, fluctuations, temporary perception shifts, possible brief existential crises, perhaps the occasional manifestation of alternate selves. Nothing they won't recover from." This was not entirely reassuring, but as no one had a better suggestion, it was accepted with the resigned pragmatism of people who had already stepped so far beyond the boundaries of normal theatrical practice that conventional concerns seemed almost quaint. "Now," Reginald said, clapping his hands together, "let's prepare for tonight's performance. Remember, embrace the quantum fluctuations. Flow with the narrative currents. And if you find yourself temporarily existing in multiple states simultaneously, try to make sure at least one of those states knows its lines." As the company dispersed, or attempted to, navigation remaining a challenge in the spatially unstable building, Max approached Felicity and Archie, who were consulting over one of Felicity's devices. "So," he said without preamble, 17% chance of creating a new universe based on Hamlet. That seems significant." "Actually," Felicity admitted, lowering her voice, "it's closer to 23%, but I didn't want to cause a panic." "Ah," Max nodded. "And is there anything we can do to, prevent this cosmic theatrical apocalypse?" Felicity and Archie exchanged glances. "Theoretically," Felicity said slowly, "if we could somehow stabilize Gerald during the performance, limit the wormhole's expansion, but that would require direct interaction with the quantum field at its strongest point, which means," Max prompted, "someone would need to approach Gerald during the climactic scene, the final duel and deaths, and activate this." She held up a small device that resembled a remote control crossed with a lava lamp. "It's a quantum field dampener. It should create a temporary boundary around the wormhole, containing its influence." "Should?" Max raised an eyebrow. "The physics involved are theoretical at best," Felicity admitted, "but it's the only option I've been able to develop." "And why can't you do this?" Max asked, already suspecting the answer. "I'll be monitoring the quantum fluctuations from the control booth," Felicity explained. "Someone needs to track the wormhole's energy signature and communicate the exact moment when the dampener should be activated, and I'll be coordinating the technical aspects," Archie added, "making sure the lighting and sound systems don't accidentally tap into other dimensions again. Last night, the soundboard briefly connected to what I believe was a death metal concert in a universe where everyone has tentacles instead of arms. We got complaints." Max sighed, the deep, soul-weary sigh of a man who has found himself, yet again, volunteered for the most dangerous role in a production that was already pushing the boundaries of sanity and physics. "So I'm supposed to activate this device in the middle of the final scene while I'm dying dramatically as Hamlet, without the audience noticing?" "Ideally, yes," Felicity nodded. "The quantum fluctuations should be at their peak during Hamlet's death scene. That's when the barrier between performance and reality will be thinnest. And when Gerald will be most vulnerable to the dampener's effects. And if I don't do this? If we just let the performance proceed naturally?" Felicity considered this. Best case scenario, the wormhole stabilizes on its own, and we continue to experience manageable reality fluctuations. Worst case scenario, new universe, got it. Max took the dampener, turning it over in his hands. It hummed softly, occasionally emitting small puffs of what looked like glitter, but which dissipated into mathematical equations when it caught the light. "How do I activate it?" "Press the red button while thinking very firmly about conventional three-dimensional space and linear time," Felicity instructed. "The device responds to mental input as well as physical. Think about normal reality, press button. Don't accidentally create a new universe based on Hamlet," Max summarized. "Seems straightforward enough. One more thing," Felicity added. "Try not to make direct physical contact with Gerald during the process. The quantum entanglement between you and the wormhole is already stronger than I'd like. Given your role as the narrative focal point, what happens if I do touch it? You might become permanently quantum entangled with all possible versions of Hamlet across the multiverse," Felicity said matter-of-factly. "Your consciousness could fragment across infinite realities, experiencing every possible interpretation of the character simultaneously for eternity." "Ah," Max nodded. "So a bit like drama school, then." This unexpected joke broke the tension, and the three of them laughed, a slightly hysterical edge to their mirth, but genuine nonetheless. They were in this together, this unprecedented theatrical experiment that had somehow become a potential cosmic event. "Don't worry," Archie said, patting Max on the shoulder. "If you do create a new universe, I'm sure you'll do a splendid job. You've always had good instincts for world-building." "Thanks," Max replied dryly. "That's very reassuring." As they parted ways to prepare for the evening's performance, Max tucked the quantum field dampener into his costume, alongside the ham and cheese sandwich he had inadvertently manifested while thinking about lunch. The sandwich, at least, made sense to him. Everything else, the wormhole, the quantum fluctuations, the possibility of creating a new universe based on Shakespeare, existed in a realm beyond his comprehension. But he was an actor, and actors are, above all else, adaptable. If tonight's performance called for him to save reality while delivering iambic pentameter and dying dramatically, then that's what he would do. The show, after all, must go on, even if going on might involve transcending conventional existence and the laws of physics as currently understood. Just another day in the theatre, really. Chapter 8. The restaurant at the end of the performance. The second performance of the infinite improbability of Hamlet began much as the first had, which is to say, with complete disregard for the conventional laws of physics, narrative coherence, and theatrical tradition. The audience, a sold-out house that included not only the usual theatre-goers, but also several quantum physicists, a delegation of Buddhist monks interested in the nature of reality, and what appeared to be a small group of interdimensional tourists, poorly disguised as humans, settled into their seats with the excited anticipation of people who have heard rumours of something extraordinary and are eager to see if reality, or what remained of it in the vicinity of the theatre, could possibly live up to the hype. Backstage, the cast and crew were going through their pre-show rituals, now augmented by the quantum stabilization devices Felicity had provided. These had been disguised as character-appropriate headgear, though the actor playing Polonius had some difficulty adjusting to the weight of his particularly elaborate wig, which contained enough technology to briefly contact the International Space Station if pointed in the right direction. Max stood in the wings, feeling the weight of the quantum field dampener in his pocket, alongside the ham and cheese sandwich that had become his inadvertent talisman. The colander hummed softly beneath his carefully arranged hair, its stabilizing influence creating a small bubble of relative normality around him, though normality had become a highly relative term in the past week. Places for Act 1, called Archie, waving his beginning of performance, quantum fluctuations, expected but hopefully manageable flag, striped blue and gold with small silver stars. The actors took their positions. The house lights dimmed, then brightened, then briefly turned a colour that had no name in any human language before settling into darkness. The stage lights came up, revealing the battlements of Elsinore, or what the audience minds interpreted as the battlements of Elsinore, the actual set having transformed overnight into something that resembled a conventional castle wall only. If viewed from certain angles and with a generous application of imagination, Francisco and Bernardo took their positions and the play began. "Who's there?" Francisco called, his voice steady, despite the fact that his uniform was subtly changing colour with each word. "Nay, answer me," Bernardo replied. "Stand and unfold yourself." From his position in the wings, Max watched as the opening scene unfolded. So far, the quantum fluctuations seemed relatively contained, props occasionally transforming, costumes shifting, the set subtly rearranging itself when no one was looking directly at it. Standard stuff, by their new definition of standard, the ghost of the confused postman made his now familiar appearance, still searching for number 42 Wisteria Lane, still carrying his eternally undelivered package. The audience, many of whom had heard about this particular anomaly from reviews or word of mouth, responded with delighted recognition, as if greeting an old friend. As the scene progressed, Max felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find Felicity, holding one of her monitoring devices, which was pulsing with an increasingly rapid rhythm. "Gerald is more active tonight," she whispered. "The wormhole's energy signature is already 30% higher than it was at this point in yesterday's performance." "Is that bad?" Max asked, though he was fairly certain he knew the answer. "It's concerning," Felicity replied, which Max had learned was scientist. "Speak for potentially catastrophic, but I don't want to cause a panic. Should I use the dampener earlier than planned?" Felicity shook her head. "It won't work until the quantum field reaches peak intensity. That still happens during the final scene, the moment of Hamlet's death. The convergence of dramatic climax and character dissolution creates a unique quantum resonance that the dampener needs to function properly. So we proceed as planned." Max nodded. "I die dramatically while saving reality. No pressure." "Exactly." Felicity offered a small smile. "Break a leg, but not literally, because the quantum instability might interpret that as an instruction rather." than an idiom, and we really don't need to add actual injuries to our list of concerns. With that cheerful warning, she slipped away, heading back to her monitoring station in the control booth. Max returned his attention to the stage where the court scene was now unfolding. The actor playing Claudius had begun his speech conventionally enough, but was now deep into his discourse on knitting, somehow connecting the tension of yarn to the tensions within the Danish court with a metaphorical dexterity that would have impressed literary scholars and fibre artists alike. The audience was rapt, many leaning forward in their seats, some taking notes, others simply staring with the wide-eyed expression of people witnessing something their brains couldn't quite process, but were determined to enjoy anyway. As the performance continued, the quantum anomalies escalated, just as Felicity had predicted. Ophelia's scenes with Polonius featured not just flowers that transformed into small singing mammals, but now entire ecosystems that briefly manifested around her, complete with weather patterns and specialized fauna that existed nowhere on Earth. When she sang in her madness, her voice split into a chorus of harmonies with itself, each singing slightly different lyrics that nonetheless formed a coherent whole when experienced simultaneously. The to be or not to be soliloquy, when it came, was the moment when Max first truly sensed the increased power of Gerald's influence. As he stepped forward to deliver Shakespeare's most famous lines, he felt a pulling sensation, as if the wormhole was trying to draw more of his consciousness into its quantum field. The colander hummed more intensely beneath his hair, its stabilizing influence fighting against Gerald's pull. Max focused on the text, anchoring himself in the words, "To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them, so far, so conventional." But as he continued, he felt the familiar shift, the words transforming in his mouth even as they remained Shakespeare's. To die, to sleep, no more, and by a sleep to say we end. The heartache and the 1,000 natural shocks. That flesh is heir to. Without changing the text, he somehow conveyed that Hamlet was not contemplating suicide, but rather considering the existential implications of sandwich consumption. The mortal coil became a metaphor for a sandwich wrapper. The dreams that might come referring to digestive processes, and yet, most bizarrely, the soliloquy lost none of its philosophical weight. But tonight there was an additional layer. As Max spoke, he became aware that he was not just delivering a sandwich-themed interpretation of Hamlet's existential crisis, he was somehow simultaneously performing every possible version of the soliloquy that had ever been or could ever be performed. He could feel them all, layered within his consciousness, the traditional readings, the modernist interpretations, the psychological approaches, even versions from parallel realities where Shakespeare had written slightly different words, or where Hamlet was a different character entirely. It was like being every Hamlet who had ever existed, all at once. The sensation was overwhelming, disorienting, and yet strangely exhilarating. Max felt his consciousness expanding, touching the edges of something vast and incomprehensible. The quantum field of narrative possibility that Gerald had tapped into. The colander hummed more intensely, pulling him back from the brink of quantum dissolution. Max completed the soliloquy, his voice steady, despite the cosmic awareness that had briefly possessed him. As he finished, there was a moment of complete silence, and then thunderous applause. The audience was on its feet, responding not just to the performance they had seen, but somehow to all possible performances simultaneously, as if they too had glimpsed the infinite variety of Hamlets that existed across the multiverse. The play continued, each scene veering further from Shakespeare's text while maintaining a strange, dreamlike coherence of its own. The player's scene became a meta-theatrical exploration of reality itself, with the actors within the play directly addressing the quantum nature of their existence. What players are these, whose lines shift like sand beneath the tide? The player king asked. We perform a play within a play within a play within a play within a play, each nested layer of reality more unstable than the last, until the very concept of real becomes meaningless. The ghost of the postman appeared again, still searching for number 40, 2 Wisteria Lane, now carrying a stack of interdimensional correspondence. I have letters for Denmark, ancient Rome, Narnia, and something called the restaurant. At the end of the universe, he announced, sorting through his bag. Anyone know where I can find these places? The Postal Service really needs to update its interdimensional maps. The audience laughed, delighted by this latest absurdity. Some even called out directions, which the ghost acknowledged with a grateful nod before fading away, leaving behind his customary scent of stamp adhesive. As the play progressed toward its climax, Max could feel Gerald's influence growing stronger. During a brief moment off-stage, Max checked in with Felicity via the small communication device she had provided. Gerald's energy signature is approaching critical levels, she reported, her voice tense. The quantum field is expanding beyond the theatre. We're getting reports of reality fluctuations up to 3 blocks away. What kind of fluctuations? Max asked. Minor ones, so far. A fire hydrant dispensing Earl Grey tea. A traffic light showing colours that don't exist in our visual spectrum. A newsstand where all the magazines feature cover stories about productions of Hamlet from parallel dimensions. That doesn't sound too bad, Max said, trying to find some optimism in the situation. It's accelerating, Felicity replied. The field's strength is increasing exponentially. By the final scene, it could encompass the entire neighbourhood, possibly the city, and if I don't use the dampener— There was a pause before Felicity answered. Based on current projections, there's a 42% chance that the wormhole will create a cascading reality failure, resulting in the formation of a new universe with its own physical laws derived from the narrative logic of our performance. 42%? Max repeated. That's a lot higher than the 23% you mentioned earlier. Gerald is exceeding my theoretical models, Felicity admitted. The wormhole seems to be enjoying itself. It's feeding on the audience's response, growing stronger with each reaction. Great, Max muttered. A wormhole with a taste for applause. Just what we needed. The dampener is our only option, Felicity said. Use it during your death scene. At the exact moment you deliver the line, the rest is silence. That's when the quantum field will be at its most vulnerable. Got it. Die dramatically, save reality. Don't create a new universe based on Hamlet. Simple enough. Good luck, Felicity said, and Max could hear the genuine concern in her voice. And Max, try not to become permanently quantum entangled with all possible versions of Hamlet across the multiverse. I've grown rather fond of this particular version of you. Before Max could respond to this unexpected sentiment, he heard his cue. It was time for the final act, the climactic duel and deaths that would determine not just the fate of the characters, but potentially the fate of reality itself. As he stepped onto the stage, Max could feel the quantum field's intensity. The air seemed to shimmer, reality becoming thin and permeable. The audience, too, seemed affected. Some viewers appeared to be temporarily existing in multiple states simultaneously, their forms flickering between different versions of themselves. The 3 Buddhist monks in the 5th row were levitating slightly above their seats, their expressions, serene as they observed the dissolution of conventional reality with philosophical interest. The duel began. Max and the actor, playing Laertes, circled each other, their weapons changing with each pass. Max was acutely aware of Gerald pulsing at the centre of the stage, the wormhole's rhythm increasing as the dramatic tension built. He could feel the quantum field dampener in his pocket, waiting to be activated at the precise moment. Gertrude drank the poisoned wine, transforming temporarily into a constellation of stars, before reforming as herself, collapsing to the stage as she delivered her final lines. The audience gasped collectively. Laertes and Hamlet wounded each other with the poisoned weapons, which, at that moment, appeared to be rolled-up copies of newspapers from various points in the future. Laertes fell, confessing Claudius's plot before dying in a shower of mathematical equations that briefly hovered in the air above his body. Hamlet turned to Claudius, who was attempting to flee, but finding that space itself had become non-Euclidean around the exits. With a final surge of strength, Hamlet forced the king to drink the remaining poisoned wine. Claudius exploded into a shower of small, brightly coloured fish that flopped around the stage briefly before vanishing through the wormhole. And then it was time. Hamlet's death, Max's final scene, and the moment when he would need to activate the quantum field dampener. Max could feel his consciousness expanding again, touching the edges of that vast field of narrative possibility. He was not just Max playing Hamlet, he was every Hamlet who had ever existed or could ever exist, across all possible realities. He could feel them all within him, a chorus of Danish princes contemplating mortality and revenge. With an effort of will, he pulled himself back, focusing on this reality, this performance, this moment. His hand closed around the dampener in his pocket as he began his final lines. Had I but time, as this fell sergeant, death is strict in his arrest. Oh, I could tell you, but let it be. Horatio, I am dead. Thou liv'st. Report me, and my cause aright. To the unsatisfied, the wormhole pulsed more rapidly, its influence reaching out to encompass the entire theatre. Reality flickered and warped around them. Max could see the audience beginning to transform, some viewers temporarily becoming characters from the play, others shifting into versions of themselves from parallel timelines. Oh, I die, Horatio, Max continued, feeling the poison, which was actually a quantum effect rather than a physical substance, working its way through his system. The potent poison quite o'ercrows my spirit. I cannot live to hear the news from England, but I do prophesy the election lights on Fortinbras. He has my dying voice. So tell him, with the occurrence, more and less, which have solicited, the rest is silence. As he spoke the final line, Max pressed the red button on the quantum field dampener, focusing his thoughts on conventional three-dimensional space and linear time, as Felicity had instructed. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the dampener began to vibrate in his hand, emitting a soft blue light that spread outward in concentric circles. The light intersected with Gerald's pulsing energy, creating a complex pattern of interference that rippled through the quantum field. The wormhole seemed to resist, its pulsing becoming more erratic, more intense. Max could feel it pulling at him, trying to draw him deeper into the quantum field, to merge his consciousness with the infinite versions of Hamlet that existed across the multiverse. The colander hummed at maximum intensity, fighting to keep him anchored in this reality. Max focused all his will on the dampener, on the idea of stability, of conventional physics, of a reality where wormholes didn't disrupt theatrical performances and sandwiches remained mere food rather than existential metaphors. The audience watched in stunned silence as what appeared to be an epic battle between cosmic forces played out on stage, though to them it might have seemed like merely an unusually dramatic death scene. The blue light of the dampener, perhaps interpreted as an innovative lighting effect. For a moment it seemed as if the dampener might fail, that Gerald's influence had grown too strong to be contained. The wormhole expanded, its edges reaching toward Max as if to engulf him entirely. Then, just as Max felt his grip on conventional reality beginning to slip, something unexpected happened. The skull of Yorick, which had been sitting on a nearby prop table, suddenly animated, its jaw clicking open. "Oi, Gerald!" it called out. "Knock, knock!" The wormhole's expansion paused, as if in confusion. I said, "Knock, knock!" The skull repeated insistently. A voice emanated from the wormhole, the first time Gerald had directly communicated rather than simply influencing reality. "Who's there?" it asked, the sound like the rustling of pages in an infinite library. "Interrupting quantum field dampener," the skull replied. "Interrupting quantum field damp." Before Gerald could finish, the dampener's blue light surged forward, enveloping the wormhole completely. There was a sound like the universe hiccuping, and then a wave of energy rippled outward from the stage, washing over the audience and the theatre building. For a brief, disorienting moment, everyone experienced all possible versions of themselves simultaneously. A flash of quantum superposition that encompassed every choice they had ever made or could have made, every path taken or not taken. Then, like a rubber band snapping back into shape, reality reasserted itself. The quantum fluctuations stabilized, the wormhole contracted to a manageable size, and the laws of physics remembered their proper functions. Max completed his death scene, collapsing to the stage as Hamlet's life ebbed away. The final tableau formed, Hamlet dead, Horatio grieving, and Fortinbras arriving to discover the Danish court decimated. The play ended. The audience, after a moment of stunned silence, erupted into thunderous applause that seemed to exist in only one dimension, a novel experience after the past two performances. The actors rose for their bows, looking dazed but exhilarated. The audience roared its approval, either for his performance or for the fact that he had managed to prevent the formation of a new universe. Based on Hamlet, it was difficult to tell which, and it didn't really matter. As the curtain fell, remaining a curtain this time, rather than transforming into butterflies or any other improbable entity, the audience remained standing, the applause continuing far longer than was customary. Backstage, the cast and crew were in a state of euphoric relief. They embraced each other, laughed, cried, and took inventory of any lingering quantum effects. These were minimal now, a prop that still occasionally changed colour, an actor whose shadow sometimes moved independently. Of its owner, the skull of Yorick, which continued to tell jokes, but with less frequency and urgency. Reginald was beside himself with joy, alternating between hugging everyone within reach and making grand pronouncements. Archie, his flags now hanging limply from his bandolier, looked shell-shocked but pleased. "We're still here," he kept muttering. "We're still here." Felicity approached Max, her monitoring device now showing stable readings. "You did it," she said, smiling. "The quantum field has stabilized. Gerald is contained." "We did it," Max corrected, gesturing to include her and Archie. Team effort, especially Yorick. Who knew the skull had such perfect comic timing? The joke was the key. Felicity nodded. It created a moment of quantum uncertainty in Gerald's expansion, a cosmic version of a double take. That split second was all the dampener needed to establish its field. So we saved reality with a knock-knock joke, Max said, shaking his head in wonder. Somehow that seems fitting for this production. Not just saved it, Felicity said, checking her readings again. Transformed it in a small but significant way. The quantum fluctuations have left a permanent mark on this theatre, and possibly on all of us as well. What kind of mark? Max asked, suddenly concerned. Nothing dramatic, Felicity assured him. The theatre seems to exist in slightly non-Euclidean space now. It's a bit bigger on the inside than the outside, and some of us may retain certain abilities. Your sandwich, manifestation, for instance, my enhanced understanding of quantum physics, Archie's flag system, which seems to have developed into a form of interdimensional communication. So we're not entirely normal anymore, Max said. Were we ever? Felicity asked with a smile. Before Max could respond, Reginald bounded over, his eyes wild with excitement. Magnificent news, he announced. The critics are already filing their reviews. They're calling it the theatrical event of the century. We've been offered a West End transfer, a Broadway run, and something called a pandimensional tour by a promoter who glows slightly and hovers 3 inches off the ground. Are we really considering taking this show on the road? Archie asked, looking alarmed, after what just happened. Of course, Reginald exclaimed, with proper precautions, of course. Felicity's dampener technology, Max's stabilization techniques. We can control the quantum effects now, use them artistically rather than merely reacting to them. And, Gerald? Max asked, nodding toward the wormhole, which was now pulsing gently. At the centre of the stage, its influence contained but still present. Gerald is the star of the show, Reginald declared, the first sentient wormhole to receive a theatre credit. Think of the publicity. As Reginald continued outlining his grand plans for the future of quantum theatre, Max exchanged glances with Felicity and Archie. There was resignation in their expressions, but also a certain excitement, the excitement of pioneers who have discovered a new frontier and, despite the dangers, can't resist exploring further. So, Max said quietly to his companions, are we really doing this? Taking a quantum unstable production on tour? It appears so. Archie nodded, already mentally designing new flags for international and interdimensional venues. The scientific possibilities are fascinating, Felicity admitted, and we've proven we can manage the risks. Plus, Max added with a small smile, the reviews are good. Very good, Archie agreed, though I'm not entirely sure what to make of the one that was written, in a language that won't be invented for another 300 years. Google Translate handled it surprisingly well, Felicity noted. Apparently we're quantum-breakingly brillig and reality-shatteringly slithy. They laughed together, the shared laughter of people who have faced the impossible and somehow emerged not just intact but transformed. In the days that followed, the players of unlikely fortune became the talk of the theatrical world. Their production of Hamlet, or what had started as Hamlet before evolving into something unprecedented, was hailed as revolutionary, groundbreaking, and quite possibly the first performance to require an advanced degree in theoretical physics to fully appreciate, according to one particularly perceptive critic. The theatre itself became a tourist attraction, drawing visitors who hoped to experience the lingering quantum effects that, still manifested in small ways, the lobby where time ran slightly faster on Tuesdays, the women's restroom that occasionally, connected to its counterpart in a parallel dimension where everything was identical except that people wore hats on their feet, the concession stand where the popcorn sometimes popped in reverse, unpopping back into kernels if you watched it too closely. Reginald was in high demand for interviews, though journalists quickly learned to bring recording equipment that could handle temporal anomalies, as his answers sometimes preceded their questions or addressed inquiries they hadn't thought to ask yet. Archie's flag system was adopted by stage managers worldwide, not because they were dealing with quantum anomalies yet, but because it proved remarkably effective for communicating complex theatrical instructions quickly and silently. Felicity published a series of papers on quantum effects in narrative spaces. That baffled most of the scientific community, but earned her a dedicated following among a small group of physicists who had been secretly studying the relationship between storytelling and reality for decades. And Max found himself in the unusual position of being famous not just as an actor, but as the man who had saved reality. While delivering Shakespeare, or at least a version of Shakespeare that involved a lot of sandwiches and quantum physics. Speaking of sandwiches, his ability to manifest ham and cheese on sourdough through sheer thought never faded. He eventually opened a small cafe next to the theatre, the Danish Prince's Pantry, which became famous for sandwiches that critics described as existentially satisfying and somehow containing infinite possibilities between two slices of bread. Gerald, the wormhole, remained a permanent fixture at the centre of the stage, contained but still active, still occasionally influencing reality in small, manageable ways that added an element of quantum uncertainty to every performance the company staged thereafter. The Skull of Yorick was given its own dressing room and a small percentage of the box office receipts, which it used primarily to collect joke books from across the multiverse, building what it claimed was the most comprehensive collection of humour in any dimension. And on quiet nights, when the theatre was empty save for the ghost light, which, in this particular theatre, sometimes actually contained ghosts, including the ever-confused postman still. Searching for number 42 Wisteria Lane, the wormhole would pulse gently, as if remembering the performances that had transformed it from a mere cosmic anomaly into a theatrical legend. Reality, it turned out, was more flexible than anyone had imagined. More like a story than a fixed set of laws, more like a performance than an immutable truth. And if that performance sometimes included quantum physics, confused postmen, talking skulls, and existential sandwiches, well, that was just the infinite improbability of theatre. Or, as Hamlet might have said, had he been written by a playwright with a better understanding of quantum mechanics, there are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your physics. To which Horatio, had he been present for the events described in this tale, might have replied, "No kidding."